Hola a todas y todos. Estamos comenzando el ciclo de charlas que la Facultad de Letras tiene programadas para esta futura Expo Novato. Nos acompaña hoy día Francisca Folch, quien es exalumna de nuestra facultad. Ella estudió letras inglesas y también tiene su doctorado. Francisca, si no me equivoco, lo sacaste en el extranjero en literatura comparada,
Lectura
¿cierto?
comparada, sí mismo, sí.
Y de ahí te fuiste, bueno, especializando en lo que es poesía y con el autor que nos va a acompañar hoy día, que es Shakespeare.
Exactamente. Muchas gracias, Loreto. Muchas gracias por la invitación a participar de este evento para entusiasmar a los alumnos a unirse a nuestra facultad. Los dejo desde ya muy invitados. Y me voy a cambiar ahora al inglés, Loreto, para ir introduciéndonos, ¿no? En el contexto de las clases de la mención en lengua inglesa, que es enteramente dictado en inglés. So, welcome. I will share my screen with you today to introduce an author that we have as a course in currently its third year of Letras Inglesas. And the title for my topic today was Why Still Shakespeare? Why are we, and it's something that I ask my students at the beginning of the course, why are we still studying Shakespeare in the 21st century? And why, in a Chilean major, are we still doing Shakespeare specifically? And why is Shakespeare the only author that has an entire course devoted to him? So why still Shakespeare then? Shakespeare, we know more or less, and I'm going to give a brief introduction to his life, or to the facts that we believe that scholars have found out about his life. Was born, we think, on the 23rd of April, 1564. That is, his parish registry was on the 26th, but then you backdate that to 3 days before, which was typically the number of days after which a person was entered into the registry. And he died 23rd April 1616. Now, those dates suggest also the creation of the myth of Shakespeare, and that's one of the reasons that we can think of why we're still looking at Shakespeare, why we're still reading Shakespeare, is the mythological, the legendary status that he has acquired throughout the decades. And it's something that wasn't automatic. It happened because of culture and educational choices and circumstances. And it's something we would take a quick look at today. So some of the facts that we know, some of the kind of the historical facts that we have about Shakespeare were his birth. His place of birth is Stratford-upon-Avon. His father was a man called John Shakespeare, who
Francisca nos comentaba que está con internet bastante intermitente, así que son las situaciones que ocurren con la nueva con estas nuevas formas de transmitir. Así que seguimos transmitiendo y les pedimos un poquito de paciencia. Esperamos que esto se pueda regularizar y de todas formas la charla va a quedar grabada, disponible en nuestras plataformas de YouTube de Letras UC. Así que...
Estoy acá de vuelta a Loreto.
Gracias, Francisca. Así que cualquier inconveniente, después esto se lo pueden...
Sí.
Sí.
Queda grabado. El problema es que el internet en Londres es muy, muy malo. En todas partes de Londres. No hay nada que hacer. So, sorry about that. So Mary Arden was of a higher social class, and at least her background was quite cultured. And William Shakespeare is quite proud of the Arden family name. Shakespeare went to a grammar school where they taught lots of Latin and where he would have learned about all sorts of subjects, including astronomy, science, maths, languages, especially Latin, and all sorts of things. So when people say, "Oh, it's impossible that a poor person or a person born in kind of a smaller town would have been able to, and who did not go to university, how could he possibly have known all of these things about which he wrote?" Well, a grammar school was quite a good comprehensive type of school. He married Anne Hathaway when he was 18, and she was about 7 or 8 years older. There's a lot of speculation about whether they got along or not. They had their eldest daughter, Susanna, and then twins, Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet, the spelling was kind of fluctuated at the time. So Hamlet is essentially Hamlet as well. And he is the one who died at 11. And at some point, William Shakespeare left for London without his family. So essentially he left his family to become an actor and a playwright when he was 28 years old. He was an actor as well. His first press apparition, and we're going to take a look at this in a second, was an accusation of plagiarism by Robert Greene. There was a time when when the plague kept the London theatres closed, and that's when he got a chance to write some sonnets. He worked outside the city walls at a theatre called The Theatre, which was managed by James Burbage. And then they moved to Bankside where they created the Globe Theatre. And where history was made, right? He wrote both under Queen Elizabeth and under King James, and he was quite crafty and a good dramatist in the sense that he managed to not get thrown into jail at a time when writing, especially performing plays, was quite dangerous and considered politically effervescent, right? It was a time when there was a lot of secrecy, plots, corruption, and where going against the grain or saying something that the rulers did not like could very well land you in prison or even executed. Towards 1607, he started to get really tired of the theatre, and at some point he retired to Stratford upon Avon again, where he had bought a really nice place. So he was also, and this is important to remember, he was also quite a good entrepreneur. So he was kind of a clever dramatist and one who saved his money and acquired a coat of arms, as you can see there in the picture. This is a draft of Shakespeare's coat of arms application to the College of Heralds. So he really kind of he was looking to become a good commercial, well-off dramatist, and he did achieve this. Look at the house that he managed to buy, like the best house in Stratford-upon-Avon. There's a lot of speculation, which is part of this Shakespeare myth that we're looking at this point, as to who was Shakespeare. All of these facts that scholars have managed to unearth have not entirely convinced everyone as to the fact of there actually being a Shakespeare who was a famous writer, for a couple of reasons that we'll examine. And I put there a picture of a very famous, not a very famous, but a film that examines kind of the Shakespeare fraud, right? So if you don't believe that Shakespeare was Shakespeare, you would call yourself an anti-Stratfordian. Anti-Stratfordians believe that the man who actually was born and bred and then moved to London was called William Shakespeare, but he wasn't the real author of these legendary plays that are so important to us even today. In part because of the lack of evidence of his importance. There's no reference, for instance, during the lifetime of Shakespeare of Stratford that links him to the author of the Shakespearean works. There were no eulogies written when Shakespeare died in Stratford at 52. This is what I mentioned. He knew too much, right? Too much music, too much about mathematics, astronomy, astrology, medicine, heraldic. How did he get to know all these things if he was not an aristocrat? In Shakespeare's will, there's no mention of books or manuscripts, which we have evidence that he read these books, given the sources and the references within the plays. But in his will, and we have his will, no mention of books or manuscripts, which would have been a very valuable object, right? Books were very scarce, and his manuscripts brought in quite a bit of money. And the only specimens that we have of Shakespeare are 6 signatures, all spelled differently, and suggesting perhaps of a frail man or of a man who wasn't used to writing. This is an excerpt of his will, and I've highlighted this bit here, which is very famous or controversial, because can you see this is taken kind of from the middle, where Shakespeare is kind of allotting his different assets, and he gives his wife, and this is in a post, it's sort of an afterthought, right? It's sort of added, right? Like, forgot, to my wife, my second best bed. So it's not the first one, it's the second one. So all sorts of speculation and fun surround that idea about the second best bed. And here are Shakespeare signatures. Notice they're all different. Some of them kind of work as abbreviations, and they're all, none of them have the spelling that we use for Shakespeare's name today. So very curious. And also we don't know what he looked like. We have guesses, ideas. The Chandos portrait there on the right, we think that represents Shakespeare. We're not really sure. There's a history of acquisitions and people buying this and changing that and kind of retouching the picture. And then the engraving that accompanies the first folio. The first folio is this large edition, very prestigious format of publishing. And this is the engraving that accompanies that kind of anthology that was created posthumously in his honor. And people who believe there's a conspiracy theory about this suggest that what is being shown in this kind of poor engraving is actually the mask of Shakespeare. Shakespeare is really not himself, if that makes sense. And you can see here, kind of behind his face, around the cheek there, kind of a mark that suggests that it's a mask that can be taken off. So if not Shakespeare, who could have written Shakespeare? We have different candidates. I'm going to show you some here in this picture, this lovely picture of Shakespeare and his friends at the Mermaid Tavern. Of course, none of this happened. Shakespeare was not friends with Sir Francis Bacon, but Baconians would suggest that the poet and philosopher, essayist Francis Bacon could have written Shakespeare's plays. John Donne, the metaphysical poet, Sir Walter Raleigh, explorer, right, also poet, or the Earl of Southampton, who is the patron, presumably the patron for Shakespeare's sonnets, are all candidates. Christopher Marlowe, Kit Marlowe, could also presumably have faked his own death. Marlowe was the preeminent, the most famous and popular playwright at his time, before he was killed with a dagger that was kind of stuck in his eye after a tavern brawl. Presumably there's some espionage drama to account for that death. But in any case, conspiracy theorists, one of the favorite theories is that Kit Marlowe staged his own death and then went to write as Shakespeare. And here are several famous authors who followed this idea of the anti-Stratfordians. You have Delia Bacon was the first one, Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Orson Welles, Charlie Chaplin, the actors, Sigmund Freud. I no longer believe that William Shakespeare, the actor from Stratford, was the author of works that have been ascribed to him. Henry James. Anti-Stratfordians have books, some of which I have read, which are quite fun. Who wrote Shakespeare? Or Contested Will, who wrote Shakespeare? And then books that kind of straightforwardly offer candidates like The End of a Lie. John Florio, the man who was Shakespeare. John Florio was an Italian aristocrat at court at the time. And Stratfordians, one of the most famous of which is Professor Stanley Wells, chairman of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford, and who still tweets I think is in his 80s now. He has a book together with Paul Edmondson called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, and you could sign a petition there saying, I believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. But then, of course, the controversy rages on with response books such as Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, exposing an industry in denial. And I think that's quite an interesting word. It is an industry. Why still Shakespeare, I ask, and as students we ask? Well, at this point, part of the answer to that is that it has become very much an industry. There's the globe that has been rebuilt, the plays that's around him, this whole publishing industry, the academia kind of nurtures itself off of Shakespeare. I mean, I love Shakespeare, but we must admit there is an industry behind this that is very, very concerned with keeping Shakespeare in his part of our culture. This is the first folio opening pages, right? You'll see 1623 there. This suggests that Shakespeare, by the time of his death and even later, was already quite famous. And to get an anthology of this size, and you can see here that the folio is a page kind of folded into half, so it's quite large. Let me see, it's quite large. It was these types of formats were kept for medicine treatises, for kind of really important accomplishments. So to have a literature person created for him suggested that he was quite prestigious at the time, quite important. Ben Jonson includes in the first folio a rule of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage, my Shakespeare rise, and he deems him sweet swan of Avon. Ben Jonson was a dramatist, famous for plays such as Every Man in His Humour and Volpone. But then, and this is where you get some sort of these contradictions. Ben Jonson also said that he finds him overlong, right? I remember the players have often mentioned it as an honor to Shakespeare that in his writing, whatsoever he penned, he never blotted out line. My answer had been, would he have blotted 1,000? So too much writing, even at the time, writers like Ben Jonson and others would have found Shakespeare kind of too wordy. So it's not only high school students, right? One of the other aspects that we should bear in mind as to why Shakespeare continues to be so relevant, I think, is the empathy of his writing, his capacity to look at these characters and not offer kind of moralizing conclusions, but rather open up questions and ask us as audiences to consider what the other person might be thinking or feeling. Think of this excerpt here. This is the only known sample of Shakespeare's handwriting, actual handwriting. And it's a speech from a play called Sir Thomas More by Anthony Mundy, which was, Shakespeare was asked in to offer a revision of this writing. And all he was asked to write here was the speech where Thomas More addresses a group of rioters, of xenophobic rioters who want immigrants to go away. Look how relevant. They want the immigrants to get out of their country. And this is what Sir Thomas More responds. Grant them removed, and grant that this your noise hath chipped down all the majesty of England. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs and their poor luggage, plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation. Should so much come too short of your great trespass as but to banish you, whither would you go? What country by the nature of your error should give you harbour? Nay, anywhere that not adheres to England, why you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased what you think to be thus used? This is a stranger's case, and this your mountainish inhumanity. Those are really powerful words. It's asking the rioters, the crowd, the angry crowd, to put themselves in the shoes of these immigrants. You would also be strangers if you were to have to be forced to leave England. Says Sir Thomas More here in this powerful speech. And again, look at not only the language, but sort of the empathy that springs from the appeal. This is the first press apparition mentioning Shakespeare, and it is a defamation. It's saying essentially that Shakespeare was a copycat, Cuervo advenedizo, an upstart crow, right, beautiful with our feathers, that his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. He is an absolute Johannes factotum. He does a bit of everything, and he pretends to be good, but he's actually stealing everyone else's lines, right? So he's a plagiarist and kind of a social climber is the accusation here of Robert Greensworth, who was an actual writer at the time. So even in Shakespeare's time, Shakespeare was not necessarily revered as this magnificent writer. And he was talented, right? But he did receive criticism like the one we just read. So his reputation started to build up as the centuries went on. During the 17th century, for some audiences and some writers, Shakespeare could be a bit too much, a bit too gloomy and kind of depressing, which is why, for instance, famously Nahum Tate changed the ending, the terrible, I'm not going to give it away, but the horrifying ending of King Lear, and switched it into kind of a fairy tale and happy ending with weddings and so on. But it was in the 19th century when the myth of Shakespeare, the legendary status of Shakespeare, became kind of enshrined, coupled with the notion of nationality, of these nations that are kind of trying to find their identity, that goes hand in hand with a romantic subjectivity that praises and starts to find value in the notion of the genius, right? So someone like essayist Thomas Carlyle will write, this King Shakespeare, does he not shine in crowned sovereignty over us all, the noblest, gentlest, yet strongest of rallying signs? So it's a sign, a symbol around which you can rally, right? Identify, find a center. Such a figure, Goethe will become that sort of figure for the Germans, Dante for the Italians, as these countries start to become, right, countries themselves, and not groups of states. And Shakespeare becomes, in the 19th century, an author that can be read by and appreciated by the whole family now, because it's dangerous and there's lots of inappropriate, often sexual jokes. There is a need also to clean up Shakespeare, and an author such as Thomas Baudelaire rewrote, to kind of edit it, Baudelarized, that's now a verb, Shakespeare, for readers who wanted to appreciate Shakespeare without incurring in the dangers of falling unaware among words and expressions which are of such a nature as to raise a blush on the cheek of modesty, right? So if you can read Shakespeare without having to kind of blush and hide all of these naughty bits, because there are a lot of naughty bits in Shakespeare. In the early 20th century, George Bernard Shaw of Pygmalion fame coined the word bardolatry for those people who are kind of in love with Shakespeare, right? Who think Shakespeare is the greatest. With the single exception of Homer, there is no eminent writer, not even Sir Walter Scott, whom I despise as entirely as I despise Shakespeare when I measure up my mind against his. It will be a positive relief to dig him up and throw stones at him, says Shaw. And Tolstoy says, Tolstoy is a Slavophile, right, and does not like foreign influence in his culture, also does something similar and writes, not only did I feel no delight, but I felt an irresistible repulsion and tedium. But then you have scholars such as Harold Bloom, who built their career on loving and kind of putting Shakespeare up on a pedestal. He declared himself a Brontosaurus bardolator, and he wrote very famously a book called Shakespeare, the Invention of the Human, where he claims that Shakespeare invented human psychology, essentially, which is kind of a large claim, but that was Bloom for you. Shakespeare continued to become really, really famous, right, with the advent of film and all sorts of, not only theater, but now film in the 20th century, so that as a writer, he could be accessible to more audiences. So, for instance, when you were too young for this, but when for Romeo and Juliet came out, Baz Luhrmann's really kind of eclectic, loud version of Romeo and Juliet came out in 1996. Shakespeare was declared dead white male of the year. For the Olympic Games in 2012, he became kind of the theme around which the games were structured. I mean, Shakespeare is everywhere, really. The Lion King, you might know, is a loose version of Hamlet, really, right? Simba kind of being haunted by Mufasa's ghost and ambition and all of that. James Bond appropriately quotes Shakespeare all the time. West Side Story, which is coming out now, is, I mean, it's another version of the original West Side Story, which in turn is really Romeo and Juliet, right? And there seems to be news about Shakespeare all the time. So for instance, this, which I found quite funny, 2015, was William Shakespeare high when he penned his plays? Pipes with cannabis residue were found in the bard's garden. So there's this kind of, what else can we find about Shakespeare, right? What other news? And there's, when talking about the influence, even if you don't want Shakespeare to influence you, right? And thinking here historically, Shakespeare wrote so many. He was part of what was understood to be a Tudor propaganda, trying to kind of build up the royal lineage of the Tudors, to legitimize that, Henry VIII and so on. Remember that he's writing in Elizabeth I, so his daughter's time. And he wrote, for instance, Richard III as this evil king, hunchback, right? Deformed in body and deformed in mind, the king who kills his nephews in the Tower. Well, actually, apparently that wasn't the case. Richard was actually a pretty good king, not necessarily deformed, or not kind of visibly deformed. And so the propaganda was so strong, or I mean, you look at Richard III, immediately you think of, and this is the news for this bit of press I love, the dark history of a wicked king. There's not even a kind of a discussion of whether this was a king or not. And you see Ian McKellen there, kind of this evil Third Reich kind of Richard III. And there are about 3 Ricardian societies dedicate themselves to try to rehabilitate the figure of Richard III from the clutches of Shakespeare's evil transformation. I don't think they've done a very good job. The Tragedy of Macbeth, this is coming out this year. I'm super excited. Apparently it's the best ever Shakespeare on screen, according to, this is the Times that just came out yesterday, 5 stars. So you can look forward to that. It's Ethan and Joel Cohen. No, I think it's just Joel Cohen this time around. He's not, the brother is not participating. Look at the cast, it's amazing. Also, I love this part, coming out December 25th. Merry Christmas, people. For some reason, it's coming December 25th. I thought that was funny. And this is a brilliant sitcom. So not only is it kind of, is Shakespeare relevant in kind of a more straightforward, praiseworthy or sense where you revere Shakespeare, but you also poke fun of him. And you can take a look at this clip over here, YouTube, Shakespeare ranting. Mi última parte era una invitación en las palabras de Caliban y se los puedo postear. O como te comentaba, puedo volver a grabar la clase para que quede íntegra y más coherente, si prefieren colgar algo más conciso.
O sea, en realidad fueron los últimos minutitos, en realidad, quizás era más para dar el cierre, pero fantástica tu exposición, la verdad que la pasión, yo creo que cautiva a cualquiera y se te nota que haces lo que haces y se transmite por los poros, así que...
Muchas gracias, Loreto. Qué pena que el internet no acompaña acá. En la tierra de Shakespeare no acompaña el internet.
Pero bueno, son cosas que pasan, tenemos que estar acostumbrados a los nuevos tiempos, así que, pero gran parte de lo que querías transmitir se logró transmitir de buena forma, así que no te preocupes y también quedamos abiertos a si hay consultas quizás más específicas o quieran ahondar un poco más, que nos escriban. Así que
Perfecto.
ahí no hay
Yo
inconveniente.
feliz.
Así que también si quieres dejar algún post o tienes el tiempo como para finalizar con otro material, lo dejamos disponible. Agradecer tu tiempo y comentarles a todos los que nos están escuchando que a partir del próximo año Letras tiene malla nueva. A partir de 2022, todos los estudiantes de hispánicas y de inglesas entran a un plan común y a partir del segundo año, el equivalente a 200 créditos, pueden optar por la mención en literatura o en lingüística. Y además pueden elegir su trayectoria. En el fondo, si la trayectoria la quieren seguir profundizando, ya sea en la literatura o en la lingüística, también pueden optar por mención más profesionalizante, eso en el sentido de pensar cómo guío esta licenciatura hacia una salida más profesional en el área de la edición, de la traducción, vincularla con cursos de periodismo quizá, con estética y también interdisciplinaria que puedo pensar en tomar cursos en otras facultades, como puede ser psicología en este momento, si no me equivoco, historia y estética. Así que con el tiempo se van a ir abriendo más posibilidades. Estamos con una malla próxima a estrenar, así que estamos todos súper expectantes. Y a diferencia de la malla actual, que los estudiantes salen con las dos menciones. En este minuto la malla tiene literatura y lingüística. En los primeros 2 años van a tener esas dos áreas de conocimiento, porque en el fondo también para los que entren y no conozcan la lingüística, quizás se puedan encantar con ella, o vienen ya definidos a que su pasión es la literatura y seguir explorándola y conociéndola, o reencantándose con esa área. Así que cerramos tu charla, Francisca. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ustedes.
Nos estaremos viendo
Que estén
pronto.
bien.
Chao, chao.
Chao.